Your grandmother never needed an instruction manual. She could press a shirt with an iron heated on a wood stove, darn a wool sock so the mend was invisible, and get a full Sunday dinner on the table using nothing but a cast iron skillet and whatever the garden gave her that week. None of it required a college degree, just repetition, patience, and the knowledge that you could not do it yourself. It simply did not get done. Then, decade by decade, the world decided you no longer needed any of it. Machines took over, services replaced know-how, and a generation's worth of practical ability quietly slipped out of daily life. Number 85 was once the fastest form of writing in the English language. Number 50 is something your grandmother did every single week without a second thought. And number 1 is a way of getting from one city to another that an entire generation practiced openly and that would terrify most parents alive today. So hit subscribe and settle in, because here are 100 baby boomer life skills that are useless today. Number 100. Adjusting rabbit ears on a television. Before cable, before streaming, before any of it, there was a pair of metal rods sticking out of the top of your TV set, and getting a clear picture meant learning exactly how to work them. You tilted one forward, pulled the other one out, rotated both slowly, and then held perfectly still while someone across the room told you whether the picture got better or worse. Move even slightly, and the whole image dissolved into static. Some families wrapped aluminum foil around the tips to boost the reception. Others attached a wire coat hanger when one of the ears snapped off. Every household had somebody who claimed to know the precise angle for Channel 4. The technique was part science and part superstition, and by the late 1970s, most people had it down to an art form they practiced without thinking. Today, there is nothing to adjust. The signal is digital, the antenna is gone, and the skill disappeared with it. Number 99. Folding a road map back into its original creases. Every gas station in America sold them, and unfolding one was the easy part. The problem was getting it back together. A standard Rand McNally road map had 16 panels and a very specific sequence of folds, and if you did it wrong, the whole thing bunched up into a wrinkled square that never fit in the glove compartment again. Families on long drives fought over this constantly. Fathers pulled over to the shoulder to refold the map they had just mangled. The skill required patience, clean creases, and the acceptance that you would probably fail the first 3 attempts. Some editions actually printed fold instructions on the back cover, which tells you how universal the problem was. GPS killed the road map entirely, and with it went the single most frustrating piece of paper in American domestic life. Rent. Number 98. Setting the tracking on a VCR. If you rented a movie from Blockbuster in 1987 and the picture came out shaky with white lines rolling across the screen, the problem was tracking. Every VCR had a tracking dial or a pair of buttons on the remote, and using them correctly was a genuine household skill. You press the button slowly, watching the lines thin out, and stop the moment the picture stabilized. Go one click too far, and a new set of lines appeared from the other direction. Rented tapes were the worst because every VCR recorded at a slightly different speed, so a tape that played perfectly at your neighbor's house could look unwatchable on yours. Kids learned to do this before they learned to ride a bicycle. The last VCR rolled off a factory line in Japan in 2016, and there has been nothing to track since. Number 97. Dialing a rotary telephone. A rotary phone had no buttons. It had a heavy plastic dial with 10 finger holes, one for each digit, and placing a call meant hooking your finger into the correct hole and dragging the dial clockwise until it hit the metal finger stop. Then you released it and waited for the mechanism to click back to the starting position before dialing the next number. A 7-digit local call took roughly 8 seconds. A long-distance number with an area code could take nearly 15. Misdial a single digit, and you had to hang up and start the whole sequence over from the beginning. Speed was not an option. The mechanism set the pace, and you learned to be patient with it. Children with small fingers struggled to reach the 9 and the 0, which sat at the far end of the rotation and required the longest pull. By the early 1980s, touch-tone phones had replaced most rotary models in American homes, and within a decade the circular dial had become a museum piece. Number 96. Programming a VCR to record a show while you were out. This was one of the most dreaded household tasks of the 1980s and 1990s. You had to set the correct channel, choose the right recording speed, enter the start time and the end time using a series of buttons that varied wildly by brand, and then hope nobody in the house changed the channel before the timer kicked in. The blinking 12 o'clock on an unset VCR clock became a national joke because so many people gave up before they even got that far. Panasonic, RCA, and Sony each designed their own menu systems, which meant the skill you learned on one machine was completely useless on another. Some families wrote the steps on a card taped to the top of the VCR. The whole ritual vanished the moment DVR and streaming services made it possible to watch anything whenever you wanted. Number 95. Using a slide rule for calculations. Engineers, students, and scientists in the 1960s carried a flat ruler with a sliding center strip and a transparent cursor. Multiplying two numbers meant aligning one logarithmic scale against another and reading the answer off a third. Division, square roots, and trigonometric functions each had their own etched scales. A skilled operator could solve a multi-step equation in under 10 seconds. NASA engineers used slide rules to calculate orbital trajectories for the Mercury and Gemini programs. The Pickett Model N600ES was the one that flew aboard Apollo 11. Texas Instruments released the SR-10 pocket calculator in 1972 for just under $150, and within 5 years the slide rule had vanished from every classroom and drafting table in the country. The skill of reading those tiny, etched markings went with it. Number 94. Rewinding a cassette tape with a pencil. Every person who owned a Walkman or a boombox in the 1980s knew this trick. When the tape player chewed up a cassette and spat out a tangle of brown magnetic ribbon, you did not throw it away. You pulled the loose tape gently out of the mechanism, smoothed it flat between your fingers, and then stuck a pencil into one of the cassette's hub holes. Turning the pencil slowly wound the tape back inside the plastic housing. Too fast and the ribbon twisted into a crease that would never play right again. Too loose and it spooled unevenly, guaranteeing another jam on the very next play. A standard number 2 pencil from any school supply kit fit the hub perfectly, which is why every teenager in America kept one next to the stereo. And the whole repair took about 3 minutes and saved hundreds of mixtapes from the garbage can. Cassettes are functionally extinct now, and so is the pencil trick. Number 93. Reading a TV guide to plan your evening. From the 1950s through the 1990s, TV Guide was one of the best-selling magazines in the country, and people did not just browse it casually, they studied it. A weekly issue listed every show on every channel for every night of the week, and families sat down together to decide what they were going to watch and when. You circled the shows you wanted, cross-referenced the times for scheduling conflicts, and made real choices because you could not record everything. Thursday night meant picking between Cheers on NBC and something else on another network and living with the decision. The skill was part scheduling and part negotiation, especially in houses with only one television. Today, every show ever aired sits on a streaming service waiting for you whenever you feel like watching it. Nobody plans an evening of television anymore. Number 92. Looking up a business in the Yellow Pages. The Yellow Pages was a thick phone book printed on bright, yellow paper, organized alphabetically by business category, and delivered free to every doorstep in America once a year. Finding a plumber or a pizza shop meant flipping to the right letter, scanning through columns of tiny print, and comparing the small block ads that businesses paid to place. You learned to read those ads quickly because the book weighed several pounds and your arm got tired holding it open. The White Pages, printed on regular stock, listed residential numbers by last name. Both volumes arrived together on the porch in a plastic bag, and more than a few households stacked old editions under a child's chair at the dinner table to give them a boost. The last meaningful print run of the Yellow Pages ended around 2017. The entire method of looking up a local business has been replaced by 3 words typed into a search bar. Number 91. Threading a film projector. Every school in America had at least one 16mm film projector sitting on a metal cart in a storage closet, and somebody had to know how to thread it. The film reel sat on a top spindle, and the loose end of the celluloid strip had to be fed through a gate, looped around a series of sprockets, passed in front of the lamp and lens assembly, and onto a take-up reel at the bottom. Get the loop sizing wrong and the film jammed inside the gate. Skip a sprocket tooth and the image jumped wildly on the screen. Teachers learned this procedure in college training courses, and in many schools, a handful of trusted older students were designated as the official projector operators. It was a genuine point of pride. Sabo. The last generation of classroom film projectors disappeared by the early 2000s, replaced first by VHS and then by digital files played off a laptop. Sabo. Number 90. Making a collect call. If you were stranded somewhere without pocket change in the 1980s, you picked up a payphone and dialed 0. An operator answered, and you told her you wanted to make a collect call to a specific number. She placed the call, and when someone on the other end picked up, she asked if they would accept the charges. If they agreed, the conversation went through and the receiving party got the bill. The real skill was knowing how to use this system without wearing out your welcome. College students calling home on Sunday nights ran up enormous collect call charges on their parents' phone bills. Some families invented codes to avoid the cost entirely. Let the phone ring exactly twice and hang up, and the parents would call back from their own line. AT&T and MCI turned the whole thing into a branding war in the 1990s. With competing 1-800 numbers and celebrity spokespeople, unlimited calling plans wiped the entire concept clean off the map. Number 89. Using carbon paper to make a duplicate copy. The way you produced a copy of a typed or handwritten document in the 1950s was by sandwiching a sheet of carbon paper between 2 blank pages. Whatever you typed or wrote on the top sheet transferred through the dark, waxy coating onto the page underneath. The pressure of a pen or a typewriter key left a reversed impression on the carbon and a clean forward copy on the second sheet. Press too lightly and the duplicate came out faded. Press too hard and you ended up with smudged blue-black ink on your fingers and everything you touched for the next hour. Office workers in the 1950s and 1960s routinely made 3 or 4 carbons of every memo, stacking the sheets with surgical precision. The abbreviation CC on every email you send today still stands for carbon copy, even though almost nobody under 50 has ever handled an actual sheet of the stuff. Number 88. Operating a mimeograph machine. If carbon paper gave you 1 or 2 copies, the mimeograph gave you 100. In schools and offices across the country from the 1940s through the 1970s, this hand-cranked duplicating machine was how worksheets, church bulletins, and office memos got mass-produced. The operator typed or drew a master stencil on a special waxy sheet, wrapped it around an ink-filled drum, and then turned the handle while feeding blank paper through the rollers 1 sheet at a time. The purple or blue ink had a sharp, sweet chemical smell that became one of the defining sensory memories of American public education. Students genuinely looked forward to getting a fresh mimeograph handout just to sniff it. Running the machine well meant controlling the ink flow, keeping the paper feed aligned, and recognizing when the stencil was wearing thin. Too much ink turned every page into a purple smear. Too little and the text faded to nothing by copy number 40. The Xerox photocopier wiped it out by the early 1980s, and that distinctive chemical smell vanished from every school hallway. Number 87. Adjusting the vertical hold on a television. Older television sets had a persistent habit of losing their vertical synchronization, which meant the picture rolled continuously from bottom to top like a slot machine that would not stop spinning. Every set had a vertical hold knob, usually tucked behind a panel on the back or side, and stopping the roll meant reaching back there and turning that knob with slow, careful pressure until the image locked into place. Go one tick too far, and the picture started rolling the other direction. Some sets also had a horizontal hold for when the image tore sideways into jagged strips. Every family member learned which way to turn and roughly how far, because each television had its own temperament. A Zenith console from 1965 needed a quarter turn to the left. A Magnavox Portable from 1972 needed a half turn to the right. Flat screens have no knobs at all, and the picture never rolls. Number 86. Cranking a car window up and down by hand. Every automobile window in America once operated with a small chrome handle bolted to the inside of the door panel. You turned it clockwise to raise the glass and counterclockwise to lower it. No motor, no switch. The mechanism was a scissors linkage and a set of reduction gears hidden inside the door, and your arm supplied all the power. Rolling down 4 windows on a hot July afternoon meant reaching across the front seat and then leaning into the back to crank each one individually. Passengers handled their own side, but the driver always got stuck with the one across from them. The real test was a child trying to crank up a window on a cold morning when the rubber seal had frozen to the glass. You had to push inward with one palm while turning the handle with the other. Power windows appeared in high-end Cadillacs and Lincolns during the 1960s and trickled down to economy cars by the mid-1990s. The hand crank handle has no place on any vehicle made today. Number 85. Writing in shorthand. For the better part of the 20th century, shorthand was one of the most respected and marketable professional skills a young person could acquire. It was a complete system of abbreviated symbols that let a trained writer record spoken words nearly as fast as they were said aloud. The 2 dominant systems in the United States were Gregg and Pitman. Gregg, introduced in 1888, used flowing curves and loops designed to follow the natural motion of the writing hand. Pitman, slightly older and more angular, relied on variations in line thickness to distinguish between different consonant sounds. Both systems replaced full alphabet letters with compact marks that represented sounds rather than individual characters, and a proficient Gregg writer could capture 120 words per minute, which was faster than most people normally spoke. Secretaries, court reporters, journalists, and executive assistants all built their careers around the skill. High schools across the country offered shorthand as a standard elective course, usually listed right alongside typing in the business department, and millions of students enrolled every year because employers expected it. Learning the system took months of daily repetition. You memorized hundreds of symbol combinations, drilled them until your hand moved without conscious thought, and then practiced taking dictation from a teacher who read prepared passages aloud at gradually increasing speeds. Gregg shorthand had its own dedicated series of textbooks published by McGraw-Hill, along with nationally standardized proficiency examinations and graded speed certificates. A certificate at 100 words per minute was a genuine credential on a resume, and many employers would not hire a secretary without one. The decline came in stages. Portable voice recorders appeared in offices during the 1970s. Personal computers arrived on desks in the 1980s. By the 1990s, most executives had stopped dictating correspondence entirely and were typing their own emails. Today, speech-to-text software converts the spoken word into written text in real time. No employer in the country lists shorthand as a job requirement. The textbooks have been out of print for years, and an entire generation's worth of carefully trained muscle memory has no remaining use. Number 84. Developing photographs in a darkroom. Before digital cameras, the only way to see your pictures was to get the film processed, either by dropping it off at a drugstore counter and waiting 3 to 5 days, or by doing it yourself in a darkroom. Serious hobbyists and high school photography students learned the full process. It started in complete darkness. You cracked open the film canister, loaded the strip onto a spiral reel by touch alone, and sealed it inside a light, tight developing tank. Then came the chemistry. Develop a solution at a precise temperature to bring the latent image out, stop bath to halt the reaction, and fixer to make the result permanent. After the negatives dried, you moved to the enlarger, which projected the tiny negative image down onto a sheet of light-sensitive paper. Exposure times were measured in seconds, and getting the contrast right meant running test strips first. A dim red safe light was the only illumination allowed while the paper was exposed. The finished prints went through their own set of chemical trays and then hung on a line with clothespins to dry. A single roll of 36 exposures could take an entire afternoon. Digital photography reduced every step of that process to pressing a button and looking at a screen. Number 83. Balancing a checkbook by hand. Once a month, the bank mailed you a paper statement listing every check that had cleared, every deposit that had posted, and the current account balance. Your job was to sit down with that statement, your own check register, and a pencil, and make the numbers agree. You went line by line, ticking off each transaction, identifying the checks that had not yet cleared, and working the arithmetic to reconcile the difference. If the bottom line did not match, you went through the whole exercise again looking for the error, which was almost always a transposed pair of digits or a small purchase you had forgotten to record. Banks printed step-by-step reconciliation instructions on the back of every statement. Some people spent an entire Sunday evening on the task. The check register itself was a slim booklet tucked inside every new box of checks, and writing in it faithfully after every single transaction was considered basic financial discipline. Online banking erased the entire ritual. Your balance updates in real time now, and nobody reconciles anything by hand. Number 82. Typing on a manual typewriter without making a mistake. A manual typewriter had no backspace in the modern sense, no delete function, and absolutely no undo. Every keystroke was final. The metal type bar swung upward, struck a cloth ink ribbon, and pressed the character directly into the surface of the paper. If you hit the wrong key, that letter was there permanently unless you unscrewed a small bottle of correction fluid, brushed the white liquid over the error, waited for it to dry, rolled the paper back into position, and carefully retyped the correct character on top of the patch. A visible correction on a business letter was considered unprofessional. Typing a flawless full page meant concentrating completely on every word before your fingers committed to it. Professional typists on machines like the Royal Quiet Deluxe or the Smith Corona Sterling could sustain 60 words per minute with near zero errors, a level that took months of structured drill to reach. High schools offered typing as a full-year course with weekly speed tests and accuracy scores posted on the wall. The personal computer and word processor eliminated the entire discipline. Today, a mistake costs you nothing more than a tap of the backspace key. Number 81. Setting the manual choke on a cold engine. Most passenger cars through the 1970s ran on a carburetor, and in cold weather, the engine needed a richer fuel-to-air mixture just to turn over and stay running. That meant pulling a knob on the dashboard labeled choke before you turned the ignition key. You pulled it out about halfway, cranked the starter, and then eased the choke back in gradually as the engine warmed up over the next few minutes. Push it in too soon, and the motor stalled in the driveway. Leave it pulled out too long, and you flooded the cylinders, which meant sitting with the hood up for 10 minutes, waiting for the excess fuel to evaporate before trying the whole sequence again. Every car was different. A 1968 Ford Fairlane needed a full pull on a January morning in Michigan. A 1974 Chevrolet Nova might only need a quarter pull in the same cold. Fathers passed this knowledge to their teenagers on the first freezing morning after they got their license. Automatic chokes took over by the late 1970s, and electronic fuel injection made the manual choke completely extinct within a decade. Number 80. Memorizing every phone number you needed. There was a time when every American carried a small telephone directory inside their own head. Your home number, your best friend's number, your parents at work, the school front office, the local pizza shop, your grandmother's house, and easily a dozen more, all stored in memory because there was no other way to place a call. No contact list existed, no screen to scroll through. You picked up the receiver and dialed from recall. Children learned their home number before they learned their home address, because any adult in an emergency might need it. Some people organized numbers by the rhythm of the digit groupings, the way a phone number naturally breaks into clusters of 3 and 4. Others associated each number with a pattern on the keypad. The mental directory grew over years and held remarkably firm. People today can still recite phone numbers from 1978 that they have not dialed in decades, but the practice of actively committing new numbers to memory died the moment cell phones began storing contacts automatically. Most people now do not know their own partner's number without looking it up. Number 79. Reading microfilm and microfiche at the library. Decades of newspaper back issues were stored on tiny strips and sheets of photographic film that could only be read on a special viewer. Microfilm came on a spool and scrolled horizontally. Microfiche came on flat rectangular cards, each one holding dozens of miniaturized pages arranged in a grid. You found the correct spool or card in a filing cabinet near the reference desk, loaded it into the machine, and then cranked through rows of shrunken text until you found the article or record you needed. The viewers were bulky, the focus knob never quite cooperated, and the backlight gave everything an eerie greenish cast. Research projects that required old newspaper sources meant hours hunched over one of these machines, squinting at print that was never as sharp as the original. Online newspaper databases replaced the entire system by the early 2000s. Libraries hauled out the viewers, and the particular skill of navigating those fragile little film sheets was gone. Number 78. Replacing a vacuum tube in a television or radio. Every television set and most household radios through the early 1960s ran on vacuum tubes, glass cylinders roughly the size of a small light bulb that amplified and controlled electrical signals. When the screen went dark or the sound dropped out, the usual suspect was a burned-out tube. The repair was surprisingly accessible for an average homeowner. You pulled the back panel off the set, identified the failed tube by checking for a darkened interior or a broken filament, wiggled it free from its socket, and carried it to the nearest drugstore or hardware store. Most of these shops kept a tube testing machine right by the front counter, a cabinet-sized device where you plugged in the tube and read a meter dial to see if it was still functional. You matched the part number stamped on the bad tube, bought a fresh replacement for a couple of dollars, plugged it in at home, and the set came back to life. Solid-state transistor technology swept through the consumer electronics industry in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and within a few years, no television sold in America contained a single vacuum tube. Number 77. Using a feeler gauge to set the gap on a spark plug. Through the 1960s and 1970s, changing your own spark plugs was considered basic automobile maintenance, the kind of thing a teenager learned in the driveway on a Saturday morning. Part of the job was setting the electrode gap precisely. The gap between the center tip and the ground electrode had to fall within a narrow range, usually between 25 and 35 thousandths of an inch depending on the engine, and you measured it with a feeler gauge. This was a fan-shaped hand tool with thin metal blades of graduated thickness. You slid the correct blade into the gap, and if it passed through with light resistance, the spacing was right. Too loose meant a weak spark. Too tight meant the plug could foul. If the gap was off, you tapped the electrode gently against a hard surface to close it or pried it open carefully with the blade. Auto parts counters at Napa and Western Auto sold feeler gauges for less than $1. Modern plugs come pre-gapped from the factory, tipped with iridium, and rated to last 100,000 miles without attention. Nobody sets a gap anymore. Number 76. Defrosting a freezer by hand. Refrigerators built before the mid-1970s did not have automatic defrost cycles. Ice accumulated steadily on the walls, and cooling coils of the freezer compartment over the course of weeks and months until the shelves were buried under a thick crust of frost and there was barely room to squeeze in a bag of frozen peas. The only fix was manual defrosting. You unplugged the refrigerator, removed everything from inside, spread old towels on the kitchen floor, and then set a large pot of boiling water inside the freezer with the door closed. The steam softened the ice enough to start prying it loose with a spatula or a butter knife. Chunks of frost dropped onto the towels, and you mopped up the meltwater as it pooled. The whole operation consumed most of an afternoon and had to be repeated every 3 or 4 months. Frost-free models became standard in American kitchens during the 1980s, and the ritual of chipping ice out of your own freezer ended permanently. Number 75. Operating a telephone party line. Many households across the country through the 1950s, particularly outside the cities, shared a single telephone circuit with their neighbors. This arrangement was called a party line, and each household had a distinctive ring pattern. 2 short rings might be yours. 1 long ring belonged to the Hendersons next door. 3 short was the family at the end of the road. The skill was recognizing your ring instantly, picking up only when it was meant for you, and setting the receiver down quietly if you accidentally lifted it during someone else's conversation. Eavesdropping was rampant and universally denied. You also had to wait your turn. If you picked up the phone and heard voices already talking, etiquette demanded that you hang up and try again later. In genuine emergencies, you could ask the other party to clear the line, but doing it too often earned you a reputation. Private lines became standard across most of the country by the late 1970s, and the entire delicate social negotiation of shared telephone service ended with them. Number 74. Fine-tuning a radio dial to find a station. AM and FM radios through the 1960s and 1970s used analog tuning, and pulling in a clear signal meant turning a small knob while listening for the broadcast to resolve out of a wall of static. The sweet spot was narrow. A fraction of a turn in, either direction could drag in a competing station or collapse the sound into hiss. Car radios were worse because the signal shifted constantly as you drove, which meant the passenger spent half the trip reaching over to readjust the dial. Some home stereo receivers had a backlit frequency band with a sliding needle, and the art was centering that needle precisely on the station marker without overshooting. Digital tuning eliminated the entire process. You press a button now and the receiver locks onto the frequency automatically. The patient craft of coaxing a clean signal out of analog noise belongs to another era. Number 73. Using the card catalog at the library. Every book in a public library's collection was once indexed on small paper cards stored in a wooden cabinet with dozens of narrow drawers. Each book had 3 cards filed separately, 1 by author, 1 by title, and 1 by subject. Finding a book meant pulling the right drawer, flipping through the cards, alphabetically locating the correct entry, copying the Dewey Decimal call number onto a scrap of paper, and then navigating the stacks to find the physical volume on the shelf. The cards were threaded onto a metal rod through a hole punched in the bottom, so you could flip through them without pulling any loose. Librarians guarded the catalog fiercely, because a single card filed in the wrong place could make a book effectively invisible to everyone who came looking for it. Schools taught card catalog skills as early as 3rd grade, and it remained a standard research competency through high school. Digital catalog terminals replaced the wooden drawers in most libraries by the late 1990s. Number 72. Writing a formal letter with a proper return address and salutation. There was a specific format for written correspondence in America, and everybody learned it in school. Your return address went in the upper right corner, or the upper left if you followed block style. The date sat directly beneath it. The recipient's full name and mailing address appeared on the left side, followed by a greeting using the correct honorific, Dear Mr. Thompson, Dear Mrs. Wallace, Dear Sir or Madam if you did not know who would open it. The body of the letter followed with paragraph indentations or block spacing, depending on which convention your English teacher had drilled into you. Then came the complimentary close. Sincerely, respectfully, or best regards, each one carrying a slightly different degree of formality. You signed your name in ink above the typed version. Businesses, schools, and government offices expected this exact layout on every piece of correspondence they received, and getting any of it wrong marked you as someone who had not been properly taught. Email wiped out the entire convention. Messages today begin with a first name and end with nothing. Number 71. Loading a dot matrix printer ribbon. Dot matrix printers were the workhorses of home and small office computing through the 1980s and into the early 1990s. They worked by striking a column of tiny metal pins against a cloth ink ribbon, which transferred the impression onto the paper behind it. When the printout started fading to a ghostly gray, the ribbon was spent, and replacing it was a hands-on task with no room for error. You lifted the printer's cover, pulled the old cartridge off its guideposts, and snapped the new one into place, making sure the fabric ribbon threaded correctly between the print head and the platen. Get the path wrong, and the ribbon bunched into a knot that jammed the head midline. Epson cartridges fed from the left, Panasonic ribbons loaded from the right. The technique you mastered on one brand was useless on another. Inkjet and laser printers replaced the dot matrix by the mid-1990s, and the snap and thread ribbon swap joined the pile of extinct office skills. Number 70. Using a hand crank adding machine. Offices, shops, and small businesses through the 1960s relied on mechanical adding machines powered by a hand lever. You punched in a number using rows of stiff keys, pulled the crank handle on the right side of the machine, and it printed the figure onto a narrow paper tape while adding it to a running total stored on internal gears. Subtracting required flipping a small lever before pulling the crank. Clearing the accumulated total meant pressing a separate key and cranking once more. The machines were heavy, loud, and oddly satisfying to operate. Burroughs, Munro, and Victor were the major American manufacturers, and a skilled bookkeeper could rip through a long column of figures with a rhythmic pull-and-punch cadence that filled the room with clicking metal. Bank tellers, store clerks, and accountants all learned the technique as a basic job requirement. The pocket calculator arrived in the early 1970s and made the mechanical adding machine obsolete almost overnight. Number 69. Filing papers in alphabetical order in a metal cabinet. Every office, medical practice, school, and government bureau ran on physical documents stored in tall steel cabinets with sliding drawers. Keeping those files organized meant mastering alphabetical filing, which sounds simple until you realize that real-world names create constant judgment calls. Does Vanderburg go under V or D? Is a folder labeled New York City Department of Health filed under N, C, D, or H? Filing rules filled entire chapters of secretarial training manuals. Speed mattered as much as accuracy, because a single document placed in the wrong folder inside a cabinet holding thousands was effectively lost. Workers developed a physical rhythm for the task. Pull the drawer, find the correct tab divider, drop the folder in, close the drawer, reach for the next sheet. Digital file systems and searchable databases made the entire discipline of physical filing obsolete by the early 2000s. Number 68. Darning a hole in a sock. When a sock wore through at the heel or the ball of the foot, you did not throw it away. You sat down with a darning egg, a smooth wooden or ceramic form shaped like a large egg on a handle, and slipped it inside the sock beneath the worn spot. Then you wove new thread across the hole with a needle and matching yarn. The technique was a grid pattern. First, you stitched parallel rows of thread in one direction to span the gap. Then you wove perpendicular rows through them to create a patch that was woven directly into the original knit. A skillful darn was nearly invisible from the outside. A clumsy one left a hard lump that rubbed against the inside of your shoe all day. Mothers taught this to daughters as basic household competency, and home economics classes in the 1950s and 1960s included it as a graded assignment. Sonashprondiv relative to wages then, so mending them made plain economic sense. Today, a pack of 6 costs less than a coffee, and the darning egg has become a collectible. Number 67. Beating a rug on a clothesline. The standard method for deep cleaning a heavy carpet or area rug through the 1940s was brute force. You carried the rug outside, draped it over a sturdy clothesline or a wooden fence rail, and beat the dust out of it with a flat wire or wicker tool called a carpet beater. The beater looked like a large tennis racket with an open weave pattern, and using it well meant swinging it in a firm, steady rhythm against the backside of the rug while thick clouds of dust exploded out with each hit. Spring cleaning across the country during the 1950s often started with exactly this task. The rugs came off every floor in the house, went over the line, and took a thorough beating before being hauled back inside. It was heavy physical work, and the skill was in the coverage. You worked in overlapping rows from top to bottom, so no section got missed. Electric vacuums had already begun replacing the practice by the 1940s, but many households kept beating their rugs into the 1960s and beyond. Number 66. Trimming and adjusting an oil lamp wick. Before electric power reached every home in the country, oil lamps and kerosene lanterns provided the primary source of light after dark in rural communities and small towns. The flame rose from a flat cotton wick that sat in a reservoir of fuel inside a glass chimney base, and keeping the light steady required regular maintenance. You trimmed the charred top of the wick with scissors to remove the carbon crust that built up after each use, adjusted its height using a small brass thumb wheel on the side of the burner, and wiped soot from the inside of the glass chimney with a damp cloth. A wick trimmed too short gave weak, flickering light. One left too long smoked badly and blackened the chimney within minutes. Rural electrification programs during the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s eventually brought power lines to the last holdout communities, and the nightly routine of trimming and lighting the household lamps faded out of daily American life. Number 65. Banking a fire to last through the night. In homes heated by wood stoves or coal furnaces, the last chore before bed was banking the fire so it would hold until morning without going out. You rearranged the hot coals into a tight mound, added a dense piece of hardwood or a scoop of coal on top, and partially closed the air damper so the fire burned just slowly enough to survive the night. Done right, you woke to a bed of glowing coals that could be stirred back to a full blaze with fresh kindling in minutes. Done wrong, and you woke in a freezing house at 5 in the morning and had to restart from scratch in the dark. The technique depended on understanding airflow, fuel density, and the particular temperament of your stove. A cast iron Franklin stove held heat differently than a pot-bellied coal burner. Central heating with gas and oil furnaces, regulated by a thermostat on the hallway wall, replaced wood and coal in most American homes by the 1960s. The quiet midnight art of keeping a fire alive has almost no remaining use. Number 64. Reading the classified ads to find a job or an apartment. Every daily newspaper carried a classified advertising section in the back pages, organized into narrow columns under category headings: help wanted, apartments for rent, automobiles for sale, and dozens more. Finding employment before the internet meant buying the morning paper, turning to help wanted, and scanning dense rows of abbreviated text. The abbreviations formed a language unto themselves. XBRIC meant experience required. EOE was equal opportunity employer. Sal commensurate W/XP meant they would decide what to pay you after the interview. You circled the promising listings with a pen, called the phone numbers, and mailed or hand-delivered a typed resume. Apartment hunting worked the same way. Sunday editions carried the biggest classified sections, and in competitive rental markets like New York City, people lined up at newsstands before dawn to grab the paper first. Online job boards displaced the newspaper classified entirely by the early 2000s, and today most dailies have dropped the section altogether. Number 63. Operating a hand-crank clothes wringer. Removing water from freshly laundered clothes in the 1940s and 1950s meant feeding each piece through a wringer, two heavy rubber rollers mounted on top of the wash tub. You pulled a wet shirt or a pair of work pants out of the soapy water, fed one end between the rollers, and cranked steadily while the rollers flattened the fabric and squeezed the water back into the tub below. The pressure was adjustable with a tension screw on top, and knowing how tight to set it was the real skill. Too loose and the clothes came out dripping. Too tight and you tore seams or popped buttons clean off. Long hair, loose sleeves, and small fingers near those rollers were a genuine hazard, and children were kept well away from the machine while it was in use. Electric wringers replaced the hand crank versions by the 1950s, and spin cycle washers made the wringer itself extinct within another decade. Number 62. Winding a clock or watch by hand. Every timepiece in America once ran on a coiled mainspring that needed regular winding. For a wristwatch, you turned the small knurled crown on the side of the case about 20 to 30 revolutions each morning until you felt firm resistance. Go past that point and you risked damaging the spring. Mantel clocks and wall clocks used a small brass key inserted into a winding hole on the face, usually once a week. Grandfather clocks needed winding every 7 or 8 days, and some models had 2 or 3 separate keyhole posts for the time mechanism, the hourly chime, and the quarter-hour strike. The morning habit of winding your watch was so automatic that people did it without thinking, the same way they combed their hair. Forget, and the watch stopped, leaving you without the time for the rest of the day. Quartz battery movements arrived in the 1970s and wiped out daily winding for most people within a decade. Number 61. Using an almanac to plan a planting season. Farmers and home gardeners across the country once relied on printed almanacs to know when to put seeds in the ground. The Old Farmer's Almanac, published without interruption since 1792, offered long-range weather predictions, regional frost date tables, moon phase, calendars, and planting guides organized by hardiness zone. The skill was not just reading the book but interpreting it, matching your specific location to the frost tables, cross-referencing the lunar cycle with traditional planting wisdom, and adjusting for local quirks that national charts could never capture. Some growers swore by it. Others used it as a rough starting point and layered in decades of personal observation. Smartphone weather data now updates by the hour, and commercial farms use satellite soil moisture readings to time their planting down to the day. The almanac still publishes every year, but it sits on the shelf as a nostalgic tradition rather than a working agricultural tool. Number 60. Dialing the operator for a long-distance call. Reaching someone in another state by telephone through the 1950s required the help of a live operator. You picked up the receiver, dialed 0, and waited for a human voice. You gave her the city, the area code, and the number you needed, and she routed the call through a chain of switching stations while you listened to clicks and silence on the line. Long-distance calls were billed by the minute at rates that topped $1 during peak hours in the 1960s, which meant families treated them as events. Calls were planned in advance, timed with a kitchen clock, and kept short. Sunday evenings after 6 offered the cheapest rates, and the whole house went quiet when someone picked up the phone because everyone knew real money was on the line. Direct distance dialing spread through the bell system during the 1960s and 1970s, and by the 1980s most calls went through without any operator at all. Number 59. Using a plumb bob to hang wallpaper straight. Wallpapering a room was a common home improvement project through the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, and doing it right started with one critical step: establishing a perfectly vertical reference line on the wall. The tool was a plumb bob, a small pointed brass or steel weight tied to the end of a length of string. You pinned the string near the ceiling, let the weight dangle freely, and waited for it to stop swinging. Gravity pulled it into a true vertical, and you penciled a line on the wall along the string. That mark was your guide for the first strip of paper, and if it was off by even a hair's width, every strip that followed would drift further out of plumb until the pattern visibly slanted. Bad and us mutig. The whole technique required patience and a steady hand. Wallpaper has fallen sharply out of fashion since the 1990s, and the few people who still hang it use a laser level that projects a perfectly straight line on the wall at the push of a button. Number 58. Splicing a broken cassette tape back together. When a tape player chewed up a cassette badly enough to snap the magnetic ribbon clean in two, the recording was not necessarily lost. If you knew how to splice, you could save it. The repair required a steady hand, a clean razor blade or a pair of fine scissors, and a roll of clear splicing tape sold at Radio Shack for about $1. First, you carefully pulled both broken ends of the ribbon out of the cassette shell, opening the housing with a small Phillips head screwdriver if the case was screwed shut rather than glued. Then you laid the two ends on a flat surface, overlapped them by roughly 1/4 inch, and cut both at a matching diagonal angle so the join would pass smoothly over the playback head without catching. You pressed a narrow strip of the splicing tape across the seam on the shiny, non-magnetic side of the ribbon only, because adhesive on the oxide side would gum up the head and ruin the sound. The tape had to be thin enough that it did not create a raised bump at the splice point, because a thick join caused an audible click or a brief dropout every time it rotated past the head during playback. After the splice was secure, you wound the repaired ribbon back into the cassette housing by inserting a pencil into the hub and turning it slowly. Then snapped the case shut and tested the tape in a player. A clean splice was nearly undetectable during listening. A sloppy one caused the tape to snag, skip, or tangle right back up inside the mechanism. This was the skill that rescued irreplaceable mixtapes made by friends, personal recordings of grandparents telling family stories, and cassettes of wedding speeches and birthday parties that existed in no other form. Radio Shack kept the splicing tape on a peg right next to the blank TDK and Maxell cassettes, and any teenager who cared about their music collection eventually learned the technique. Compact discs replaced cassettes as the dominant format by the mid-1990s, and within another decade, digital files made the physical recording medium itself irrelevant. There is nothing left to splice. Number 57. Stripping and recaning a chair seat. Cane-bottom chairs were standard furniture in American kitchens and dining rooms for most of the 20th century, and the woven seats eventually wore through. When a seat sagged or gave way, you did not buy a replacement chair. You recaned it yourself. The job started with stripping out the old broken cane, then soaking fresh cane strips in warm water until they were flexible enough to weave without cracking. You threaded the strips through holes drilled around the perimeter of the seat frame in a specific sequence: vertical strands first, then horizontal, then 2 sets of diagonals, with each layer woven through the ones beneath it. Tension had to be consistent on every strand, because loose cane sagged under body weight almost immediately. Hardware stores sold cane by the hank, and libraries kept how-to books with illustrated step-by-step diagrams. Mass-produced chairs with molded plastic or upholstered seats replaced most cane furniture by the 1980s, and recaning became an artisan craft rather than a common household repair. Number 56. Loading and advancing. A roll of 35mm film in a camera. Every photograph taken before the digital era required a roll of physical film loaded into the camera by hand. A standard roll of Kodak Gold or Fuji Superia came sealed in a small metal canister, and loading it meant opening the camera back, pulling the film leader out to the take-up spool, engaging it in the slot, and then closing the back and advancing to frame 1 using a thumb lever or a winding knob on top of the camera body. If the film did not catch the spool correctly, you could shoot an entire vacation's worth of pictures and discover when you opened the camera that the roll had never moved at all. Every exposure required manually winding the film to the next frame before pressing the shutter again. At the end of the roll, you rewound the film back into its canister with a small folding crank on the camera's bottom plate, because opening the back with exposed film still out meant destroying every image on the strip. Digital sensors and memory cards made the entire ritual extinct. Number 55. Using traveler's checks on a vacation. The safe way to carry money while traveling through the 1980s was to purchase traveler's checks. American Express was the dominant issuer, You bought them at your local bank in fixed denominations of $20, $50, or $100, signing each check once at the time of purchase. When you spent one at a hotel, a restaurant, or a shop, you signed it a second time in front of the cashier, and the two signatures had to match as proof of identity. If the checks were lost or stolen, American Express guaranteed replacement, which was the entire selling point. The skill was logistical, buying the right mix of denominations for your trip, recording the serial numbers on a separate sheet kept in a different pocket in case of theft, and remembering to countersign at the point of sale rather than pre-signing them all at home. Universal ATM access and contactless payment cards made the traveler's check redundant by the early 2000s, and the careful pre-trip ritual of signing paper money has no remaining purpose. Number 54. Reading a printed bus or train schedule. Public transit agencies publish their routes and departure times on printed folding cards available at station windows and on the vehicles themselves. Understanding one was a specific literacy skill. Routes ran in columns across the top, and time points ran down the left side. You cross-referenced your starting stop with your destination, found the matching column, and traced your finger down to the departure time that fit your day. Weekday, Saturday, and Sunday schedules were printed on separate panels of the same card, and express services that skipped certain stops were marked with dashes or coded footnotes in very small type. Misread the schedule, and you stood at the wrong corner or arrived an hour early for a bus that had already passed. Real-time transit apps with GPS tracking have made the printed timetable completely unnecessary. You pull out your phone now and it shows you exactly when the next vehicle arrives. Number 53. Reading a barometer to predict tomorrow's weather. Many American households through the 1960s kept a barometer hanging on the hallway wall. The instrument measured atmospheric pressure, and interpreting it correctly was a real skill built up over time. A steady rise in the needle generally meant fair weather ahead. A rapid drop warned of an approaching storm. The speed of change mattered more than the absolute reading, which meant you had to check the instrument regularly and track the trend over hours. Most people tapped the glass face gently before reading it, a habit that helped the needle settle to its true position. Aneroid barometers, the most common household type, had a second reference needle that you set manually to mark yesterday's reading so you could spot the direction of movement at a glance. The Hinken. The whole practice depended on pattern recognition built up across years of daily observation. Weather apps now deliver satellite forecasts updated hourly, and the wall-mounted barometer has been reduced to a piece of decorative nostalgia. Number 52. Addressing an envelope with the correct postal format. Sending a letter required a specific layout on the front of the envelope, and every child in America was expected to learn it. The recipient's name went centered on the first line, street address on the second, city, state, abbreviation, and zip code on the third. Your return address went in the upper left corner and the stamp in the upper right. Teachers drilled this format in 3rd or 4th grade, and some would hand back improperly addressed practice envelopes and make the student redo them. Business correspondents added a company name line between the recipient and the street address. Getting it wrong was not just embarrassing, it could delay delivery, trigger a return to sender, or lose the letter entirely. Email and text messaging have cut personal letter writing to nearly zero, and most adults under 30 have never had to address a physical envelope for any purpose at all. Number 51. Operating a manual telephone switchboard. Before automated switching equipment, every phone call placed in America was connected by a human operator sitting at a large panel lined with rows of jacks and patch cords. A signal light on the board indicated an incoming call. The operator plugged one end of a cord into the caller's jack, asked for the desired number, and plugged the other end into the corresponding jack on the board to complete the circuit. At a busy city exchange, operators handled dozens of calls per minute, and mixing up a single cord could connect a doctor to a dry cleaner or drop an urgent call entirely. The Bell system employed hundreds of thousands of switchboard operators at peak capacity, nearly all of them women, and the position required formal training in equipment operation, exchange geography, and telephone courtesy. In small towns, operators often knew every subscriber by name and could place a call without being given a number. Automatic switching technology progressed in stages throughout the mid-20th century, and the last staffed manual exchanges closed for good during the 1980s. Number 50. Churning butter by hand. Making butter at home was a standard kitchen task in rural America well into the 1950s and beyond. You poured fresh cream into a tall wooden or glass churn, inserted the dasher, a long stick with a paddle on the end, and pumped it up and down for 20 to 30 minutes until the fat separated from the buttermilk. The rhythm mattered. Too fast and you tired out before the butter formed. Too slow and nothing happened. You could feel the change in resistance when the cream started to thicken, and experienced churners knew exactly when to stop, drain the buttermilk, and knead the solid butter in cold water to wash out the remaining liquid. A batch from 2 gallons of cream produced about 3 to 4 pounds of butter. Anyone who stood at a churn as a child and felt that shift in resistance remembers the moment exactly. Store-bought butter in foil-wrapped sticks made the churn unnecessary in most homes by the 1960s, and the skill survives today only as a novelty demonstration at county fairs. Number 49. Using a washboard to scrub laundry. Getting clothes clean in the early 20th century meant standing over a metal stand, washboard propped inside a wash tub full of hot soapy water, and rubbing each piece of fabric up and down across the ridged surface. The ridges, usually made of galvanized zinc or ribbed glass, created friction that loosened dirt from the fabric. The technique was physical and methodical. You worked each piece against the ridges in short, firm strokes, paying extra attention to collars, cuffs, and the knees of work pants where ground-in grime collected. A full basket of laundry could take more than an hour. The work was hard on hands, hard on clothes, and hard on backs. Soap was usually a bar of Fels naphtha rubbed directly onto the worst stains. Electric washing machines with agitators began appearing in American homes during the 1930s and 1940s, and by the 1960s the washboard had been retired from regular duty in most of the country. Number 48. Pressing a sharp crease into dress trousers with a hot iron. Wearing pressed slacks to work, church, or school was expected through the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, and the crease did not come from a dry cleaner. It came from a kitchen ironing board and a heavy steam iron. You laid the trouser leg flat with the front and back seams aligned, placed a damp pressing cloth over the fabric to prevent shine, and pressed the iron firmly along the intended crease line from the waist to the cuff. Both legs had to match perfectly. A crooked crease was worse than no crease at all. Cotton and wool took well to pressing. Polyester double knit, which flooded the market in the 1970s, practically creased itself and needed almost no attention. The rise of casual dress codes, wrinkle-free synthetic fabrics, and the general decline of formal daily clothing has made trouser pressing a disappearing domestic skill. Number 47. Patching a pair of work pants by hand. When the knee of a pair of jeans or work trousers wore through, you did not throw them out. You cut a piece of matching or heavy fabric into a rectangle slightly larger than the hole, pinned it to the inside of the garment, and hand-stitched it into place using a needle and heavy-duty thread. The stitches had to be tight and even, close enough to the edge to hold under stress, but not so close that the fabric frayed again in a week. Some patches were sewn from the inside so only a faint outline showed on the exterior. Others were sewn on the outside and became a visible part of the garment. Iron-on patches appeared in the 1960s and simplified the process, but the hand-sewn version remained the more durable repair. Ready-made clothing is cheap enough now that patching is rarely worth the effort, and the hand-stitching skill has become a craft hobby rather than a household necessity. Number 46. Taping a song off the radio onto a blank cassette. The only free way to own a copy of a song you loved in the 1970s and 1980s was to capture it live off the radio. The process required patience, timing, and a cassette recorder with a built-in radio tuner or an auxiliary cable connected to a separate receiver. You listened to your favorite station for hours, waiting for the disc jockey to play the song you wanted. When you heard the opening notes, you had to hit the record button instantly, because every second of hesitation meant losing the beginning. The best recordings started clean, right on the first beat, with no DJ chatter bleeding into the intro. But radio stations almost never played a song without talking over the start or the end. So a truly clean recording was rare and treasured. Serious tapers learned the habits of their local DJs. Some jockeys paused before the song. Others talked right up to the first lyric. You figured out which stations gave you the cleanest intros and planned your taping sessions around their playlists. A 90-minute Maxell or TDK blank cassette could hold about 20 songs, and filling one with a curated selection of radio captures was the original form of the personal playlist. The mixtape that resulted was deeply personal. You labeled it with a felt-tip pen, decorated the case insert with hand-drawn artwork, and sometimes gave it away as a gift that carried more emotional weight than a store-bought album ever could. Napster, iTunes, and streaming services replaced the entire process. Music is now available instantly, endlessly, and without effort. But nothing that came after ever replicated the particular satisfaction of catching a perfect recording off a late-night radio broadcast with no talking, no static, and the song captured whole from the very first note. Number 45. Polishing shoes to a mirror shine. Through the 1950s, 1960s, and into the 1970s, a well-kept pair of shoes was a basic expectation for any man heading to work, church, or a social event. The polishing routine was specific. You spread old newspaper on the floor, placed the shoe on a foot-shaped wooden shoe tree, or stuffed it with paper to hold its shape, and applied a thin coat of kiwi paste wax with a soft rag in small circular strokes. After the wax dried to a matte film, you buffed it with a horsehair brush using quick back-and-forth strokes until the leather gleamed. Military recruits learned a more intense version called spit shining, which involved dripping water onto the polish and rubbing in tiny circles until the surface reflected like glass. Shoe shine stands were a fixture in train stations, barber shops, and hotel lobbies. Casual footwear, sneaker culture, and the decline of leather dress shoes in daily life have made the skill largely irrelevant. Number 44. Dialing 411 for directory assistance. If you needed a phone number and did not have a phone book handy, you dialed 411. A live operator answered, asked you for the city and the name of the person or business you were trying to reach, and then read the number back to you. In many areas, the service was free from a home phone, which made it the fastest way to find a number without getting out of your chair. The skill was knowing how to use it efficiently, giving the operator the correct spelling, specifying the city, and being ready to write the number down because she would only say it once. Some people called 411 multiple times a day and treated it like a spoken version of the phone book. Phone companies began charging for directory assistance calls during the 1980s, and internet search engines finished it off entirely. Lumped. The idea of calling a stranger to ask for a phone number sounds almost absurd. Now, number 43. Writing a personal check at the grocery store. Through the 1970s, 1980s, and into the 1990s, paying for groceries with a personal check was completely normal. You filled in the store's name, the amount in numbers and words, the date, and your signature, then handed it to the cashier along with a photo identification card. The cashier examined the check, compared the signature to your ID, and sometimes wrote your driver's license number on the face of the check before placing it in the register. The skill was filling it out quickly and legibly while a line of people waited behind you. Some stores required a check cashing card that you applied for separately. Others used a verification system that called a central number to approve the check before the transaction went through. Debit cards and tap-to-pay systems have made the personal check virtually extinct at retail counters. Most people under 40 have never written a check for any purpose at all. Number 42. Looking a word up in a physical dictionary. If you did not know how to spell a word, what it meant, or how to use it correctly, You reached for the dictionary on the bookshelf. Every household, classroom, and office had one. Webster's New World and Merriam-Webster were the standard American editions, thick hardcover volumes with tissue-thin pages and thumb-cut index tabs along the edge. The skill was navigating the alphabetical layout quickly, estimating roughly where in the book the word fell, flipping to the right section, and scanning the guide words printed at the top of each page to zero in on the correct entry. Students used dictionaries for homework every night, and teachers assigned dictionary drills as a standard language arts exercise. The definition was right there in front of you, along with pronunciation guides, part of speech, etymology, and usage examples. Typing a word into a search engine is faster, but it replaced a reference skill that every literate American once practiced routinely. Number 41. Converting measurements using a printed reference table. Translating between cups and milliliters, or pounds and kilograms, or Fahrenheit and Celsius once meant consulting a printed conversion chart taped to the inside of a kitchen cabinet. Cookbooks had them on the inside covers. Science textbooks printed them in the appendix. Some households kept a laminated conversion chart taped to the inside of a kitchen cabinet door. The skill was knowing where to look and how to read the grid correctly, matching the row to the column, and interpolating when the value you needed fell between two listed entries. Carpenters converting fractions of an inch to decimal equivalents used wallet-sized reference cards they carried in their tool belts. The entire practice has been eliminated by smartphones, where a conversion requires nothing more than speaking a question out loud and hearing the answer spoken back. Number 40. Filing a paper tax return by hand. Every American taxpayer once sat down with a pencil, a stack of paper forms from the Internal Revenue Service, and a shoebox full of receipts, and did the math by hand. You filled in your name, your social security number, your wages from the W-2 your employer mailed you, and then worked your way through lines of arithmetic, adding, subtracting, and transferring numbers from one form to another. If you itemized deductions, the process branched into additional schedules and worksheets that could easily reach 10 or 15 pages. The math was done by hand or with a pocket calculator, and a single arithmetic error could trigger an audit notice months later. You signed the return, attached your W-2 with a paperclip, sealed it in an envelope, and mailed it to the IRS processing center before April 15th. Tax software like TurboTax and free electronic filing have made the paper form almost completely obsolete. Number 39. Copying a recipe onto an index card by hand. Home cooks through the 1960s and 1970s built their own recipe collections by hand. When you tasted something good at a church supper or a neighbor's kitchen, you asked for the recipe, and the owner dictated it or wrote it out on a piece of paper. You took it home and copied it neatly onto a 3x5 index card using your best handwriting. The cards were filed in a small metal or wooden recipe box, organized by category: main dishes, desserts, salads, breads. Over decades, a recipe box became a personal archive. The handwriting changed as the years passed. Splattered cards showed which recipes got used the most. Some boxes were passed down through families and carried 3 generations of cooking in a single container. Recipe websites and Pinterest have replaced the practice entirely. The index card box now sits in an antique shop rather than on a kitchen counter. Number 38. Making ice cream with a hand crank freezer. Before electric ice cream makers, the only way to make ice cream at home was with a hand-cranked wooden bucket freezer. You poured the custard mixture into a metal canister, sealed it with a lid and dasher assembly, and set it inside a wooden bucket surrounded by layers of crushed ice and rock salt. Then someone started cranking the handle on top. The crank turned the canister inside the salted ice bath, and the cold transferred inward while the dasher scraped the freezing cream off the walls. As the mixture thickened, the cranking got harder, and families took turns at the handle. Children waited eagerly for the moment when the crank became too stiff to turn, because that meant the ice cream was done. The whole process took about 30 minutes of steady effort. White Mountain was the best-known brand of hand crank freezer in America. Electric models and supermarket ice cream made the hand crank version a backyard novelty rather than a kitchen essential. Number 37. Sharpening a blade on a pedal-powered grindstone. The tool for putting an edge on an axe, a hoe, a mower blade, or a heavy knife through the 1950s was a pedal-operated grindstone. The stone was a flat disc of sandstone mounted on an axle between two supports, and you powered it with a foot pedal connected by a crank, the same way a treadle sewing machine worked. You held the blade against the spinning stone at the correct angle, usually about 20 degrees, and let the abrasion do the work. Water dripped onto the stone from a trough to keep the metal cool and prevent the abrupt temper from being drawn out by heat. The skill was in the angle and the pressure. Too steep and you ground away too much metal. Too shallow and the edge was dull. A good sharpener could restore a rusted hatchet to a working edge in a few minutes. Electric grinders and diamond-honed sharpening systems replaced the treadle grindstone almost entirely by the 1970s. Number 36. Setting the timing on a car's distributor. Through the 1960s and 1970s, a car engine's ignition timing was controlled by a mechanical distributor, and keeping it set correctly was part of routine maintenance. The distributor determined exactly when each spark plug fired relative to the piston's position, and if the timing drifted even a few degrees, the engine ran rough, lost power, or pinged on acceleration. You adjusted it with a timing light, a strobe device that clipped to the number 1 spark plug wire and flashed in sync with the firing. With the engine idling, you aimed the strobe at timing marks on the crankshaft pulley and loosened the distributor hold-down clamp to rotate the housing until the marks aligned. Then you tightened the clamp and checked again. Getting it right meant the difference between an engine that purred and one that coughed. Electronic ignition systems arrived in the mid-1970s and made the distributor adjustment unnecessary on most vehicles within a decade. Number 35. Starching a dress shirt by hand. A crisp, starched dress shirt was standard business attire through the 1950s and 1960s, and achieving that stiffness at home was a manual process. You mixed liquid laundry starch with water in a basin, dipped the collar, cuffs, and shirt front into the solution, wrung them out lightly, and then ironed the damp fabric with a hot iron until it dried smooth and rigid. The result was a collar that stood up on its own and cuffs that held their shape all day. Too much starch made the shirt feel like cardboard against your skin. Too little, and the collar wilted by lunchtime. Some households used spray starch from an aerosol can, which simplified the process but never quite matched the finish of a proper dipped and ironed job. Permanent press fabrics and the collapse of formal daily dress codes made hand starching virtually obsolete by the late 1970s. Number 34. Running a spirit duplicator at school. The spirit duplicator, also called a ditto machine, was the simpler, cheaper cousin of the mimeograph, and it was everywhere in American schools from the 1950s through the 1980s. A teacher wrote or typed a master sheet using special carbon-backed paper that left a reversed image in purple dye on the back of the page. That master was mounted on a rotating drum moistened with methyl alcohol, and when you turned the crank, each sheet of paper that passed through picked up a thin layer of the dye. The copies came out in that distinctive pale purple ink, slightly damp and smelling sharply of the alcohol solvent. Students pressed the freshly printed worksheets to their faces and inhaled deeply, a ritual that happened in every classroom in the country. The copies faded if left in sunlight, and the master sheet wore out after about 100 impressions. Xerox machines and later digital printers made the ditto machine obsolete by the late 1980s. Number 33. Navigating a road trip using only printed signs and highway markers. Getting from one city to another by car in the 1970s meant reading highway signs and memorizing the route before you left. You studied a map at home, wrote the sequence of highway numbers and exit names on a piece of paper, and then watched for signs as you drove. Interstate shields, state route markers, and green directional signs were your only guidance. Miss one sign and you might drive 30 miles in the wrong direction before the next one told you so. Passengers served as navigators, calling out upcoming exits while the driver focused on traffic. Some drivers memorized entire cross-country routes by the sequence of highway numbers. The skill demanded attention, spatial awareness, and the ability to make quick decisions at high-speed interchanges. GPS navigation systems arrived in cars during the early 2000s, and smartphone mapping apps finished the job. The idea of driving to an unfamiliar city without a screen telling you where to turn has become almost unthinkable. Number 32. Taping over the Write Protect tab on a cassette. Every pre-recorded cassette tape and every blank tape you had already filled with music had a small plastic tab on the top edge of the shell. When that tab was intact, the tape could be recorded over. When it was broken out, the recorder's mechanism refused to engage, protecting whatever was on the tape. Record labels snapped the tabs off commercial releases so buyers could not accidentally erase them. But if you wanted to reuse that tape, the fix was simple. You pressed a small piece of cellophane tape or a strip of adhesive label over the empty tab hole, which fooled the recorder into treating the cassette as blank again. The skill was knowing which hole to cover and not accidentally taping over a recording you wanted to keep. The entire concept of write protection on a physical medium vanished along with the cassette. Number 31. Patching a bicycle tire inner tube. When a bicycle tire went flat, the repair was straightforward and every kid who rode a bike eventually learned it. You removed the wheel, pried the tire off the rim with a pair of tire levers, and pulled the inner tube out. Then you inflated the tube slightly and submerged it in a bucket of water, watching for the stream of tiny bubbles that revealed the location of the puncture. You dried the spot, roughened it with a small piece of sandpaper from the patch kit, spread a thin layer of rubber cement over the area, waited for it to get tacky, and pressed a round rubber patch firmly into place. After a few minutes of pressure, the patch bonded to the tube and held air. You reassembled the tire on the rim, reinflated it with a hand pump, and rode away. Patch kits cost less than $1 at any hardware store. Self-sealing tubes and cheap replacement inner tubes have made hand patching increasingly rare. Number 30. Adjusting the idle on a carburetor. Every car engine through the early 1980s breathed through a carburetor, a mechanical device that mixed air and gasoline in the right proportion for combustion. When the engine idled too fast, too slow, or too rough, the fix usually started with a single small screw on the side of the carburetor body called the idle mixture screw. Turning it clockwise leaned out the fuel mixture. Turning it counterclockwise enriched it. The goal was to find the sweet spot where the engine ran smooth and steady at about 600 to 800 revolutions per minute without stalling or racing. You did this by ear. A rich idle sounded thick and heavy, with a faint smell of unburned fuel. A lean idle sounded thin and snappy, and if you leaned it too far, the engine stumbled and died. A second screw, the idle speed screw, controlled the throttle plate opening and set the base speed. The two worked together, and adjusting one often required readjusting the other. Experienced shade tree mechanics could set a carburetor by sound alone in under 5 minutes, using nothing but a flathead screwdriver. Different carburetors had different temperaments. A Rochester 2-barrel on a Chevy small block was forgiving and predictable. A Holley 4-barrel on a big block Ford was sensitive and needed frequent readjustment, especially when the seasons changed and the air density shifted. Fuel injection systems, which use electronic sensors and computer-controlled injectors to manage the air-fuel ratio automatically, began replacing carburetors in American passenger cars during the mid-1980s. By 1990, the carburetor was effectively gone from new vehicle production. The quiet skill of setting an idle with a screwdriver and a trained ear went with it. Number 29. Replacing a blown fuse in a fuse box. The electrical system in every American home through the 1960s was protected by screw-in glass fuses. When a circuit overloaded, the thin metal strip inside the fuse melted and broke the connection, cutting power to that part of the house. You grabbed a flashlight, went to the fuse box, identified the blown fuse by its darkened or broken window, unscrewed it, and screwed in a fresh one of the chin. Correct amperage. Using the wrong amperage was dangerous. A 15-amp fuse in a 20-amp slot would blow too easily. A 30-amp fuse in a 15-amp circuit could let the wiring overheat and start a fire. Hardware stores sold fuses in multi-packs for a few cents each. Circuit breaker panels, which simply trip a switch and can be reset without replacing anything, became the norm in new construction by the 1960s and 1970s. Number 28. Siphoning gasoline from one tank to another. Before, fuel transfer pumps were common, and before modern anti-siphon valves were built into car filler necks, moving gasoline from one vehicle to another, or from a car into a gas can, was done the old-fashioned way. You inserted a length of clear rubber hose into the fuel tank, sucked on the free end until you tasted gasoline in the back of your throat, and then quickly dropped the hose end into the receiving container before gravity kept the fuel flowing. The skill was in the timing of the mouth pull. Too tentative, and the siphon did not start. Too aggressive, and you got a mouthful of gasoline. Farmers, mechanics, and anyone with a boat or a lawnmower knew the technique. Anti-siphon screens in modern fuel filler necks and portable battery-powered transfer pumps have made the mouth-start siphon almost impossible on newer vehicles and entirely unnecessary on older ones. Number 27. Replacing and tensioning a window screen. Every window in an American house once had a removable screen that let air in and kept insects out. The screens tore, sagged, and wore through, and replacing the mesh was a routine home repair. You pried out the rubber spline that held the old screen material in the frame's channel using a flat screwdriver, pulled the damaged mesh away, laid a new piece of fiberglass or aluminum screening over the frame, and pressed the spline back into the groove with a special roller tool. Tension was everything. Too loose and the screen bowed inward in the breeze. Too tight and it pulled the frame out of square. You trimmed the excess mesh with a utility knife after the spline was seated. Hardware stores sold screening by the roll and spline by the foot. Air conditioning and fixed-pane windows have made screen replacement an increasingly rare household task. Number 26. Smacking the side of a television to fix the picture. This was not a joke. It was a real, widely practiced repair technique that actually worked, and almost every family in America knew it. When a television set from the 1950s, 1960s, or 1970s lost its picture, developed a rolling line, or flickered to static, the first response in most households was a firm, open-palmed slap on the side or the top of the cabinet. The technical explanation was simple. Vacuum tubes and their socket connections loosened over time, and a sharp physical impact could reseat a tube that had vibrated loose in its socket, restoring the electrical contact. The skill, if you could call it, 1. was knowing how hard to hit and exactly where. Too gentle and nothing changed. Too hard and you cracked something. Some families had a designated hitter for the television. Solid-state transistor electronics, which have no tubes to jar loose, made percussive maintenance permanently pointless by the late 1970s. Number 25. Using a payphone. Payphones stood on nearly every street corner, gas station lot, and shopping center entrance in the United States from the mid-1960s through the 1980s. Using one was a specific, practiced sequence. You lifted the handset, listened for the dial tone, dropped in a dime, later a quarter, and dialed the number. If the person did not answer, you pressed the coin return lever and got your money back. Long-distance calls required a pocket full of change or a calling card number entered on the keypad. You learned to cup the receiver against your ear to block out traffic noise, and you kept your conversations short because someone was almost always waiting behind you. At peak, there were over 2 million payphones installed across the country. The number has dropped below 100,000, and most of those are disconnected. The phone booth itself has become a piece of street archaeology. Number 24. Waxing a car by hand with paste wax. Keeping a car's paint job protected and shining meant spending a Saturday afternoon with a can of paste wax and a handful of soft cotton rags. You washed the car first, let it dry completely, then scooped a dab of wax from the tin with a damp cloth and rubbed it onto the paint in small circular strokes, one panel at a time. After it dried to a chalky haze, you buffed it off with a clean cloth until the surface gleamed. The whole car took 2 to 3 hours. Turtle Wax and Simonez were the brands every family kept in the garage. The skill was in the application. Too much wax left white streaks in the seams and trim. Too little gave no protection at all. Modern clear coat finishes, spray-on ceramic coatings, and automated car washes have made hand waxing a hobbyist ritual rather than a maintenance requirement. Number 23. Operating a reel-to-reel tape recorder. The home recording format of the 1960s was reel-to-reel tape, and setting up the machine was a multi-step procedure that required genuine skill. You mounted the supply reel on the left spindle, threaded the tape through a set of guides, and passed the playback head, and attached the free end to the take-up reel on the right. The tape had to pass over the heads at the correct tension, and if it was loose, it wobbled and distorted the sound. Recording speeds were selectable, usually 3 3/4 or 7.5 inches per second, and higher speeds gave better fidelity at the cost of shorter recording time. Audiophiles used reel-to-reel machines from brands like Revox, Akai, and Teak to make high-quality home recordings that cassette decks could not match. The format was overtaken by the convenience of the compact cassette during the 1970s and eventually rendered obsolete by digital recording. Number 22. Using a CB radio and knowing the trucker lingo. Citizens Band radio exploded in popularity during the mid-1970s, fueled by the national 55-mile-per-hour speed limit and the trucker culture that resisted it. Operating a CB meant knowing which of the 40 channels to use, how to key the microphone, and when to let go so others could talk. Channel 19 was the unofficial highway channel. Channel 9 was reserved for emergencies. You learned a vocabulary of slang. A Smokey was a highway patrol officer. A bear in the air was a police helicopter. 10 to 4 inches meant understood, and your handle was your on-air name. The skill was part technical, part social. You could not talk over someone else. You kept transmissions short, and you followed an unwritten protocol about who spoke when. Cell phones and GPS-based traffic apps replaced every practical function the CB served, and the radios have largely disappeared from passenger vehicles. Number 21. Applying correction fluid to a typewritten page. When you made a mistake on a typewriter and correction tape was not available, the backup was a small bottle of opaque white liquid called correction fluid. The best-known brand was liquid paper, invented by Bet Nesmith Graham in 1956. You unscrewed the cap, which had a small brush attached to the underside, dabbed the white fluid over the wrong character, waited for it to dry, and then rolled the paper back into position and typed the correct letter on top of the dried patch. The result was never invisible. The white patch was slightly raised and a different shade from the rest of the page, but it was acceptable for internal documents and school papers, if not for formal business letters. Applying it well meant using the minimum amount and keeping the brush strokes tight. Too much and the patch bubbled. Word processors and computers eliminated the need for any form of physical correction. Number 20. Adjusting the counterweight on a record player tone arm. Playing a vinyl record without damaging it required setting the tone arm's tracking force correctly. Every turntable had a small counterweight on the back end of the tone arm, and you adjusted it by rotating the weight until the arm floated level, then dialing in the exact pressure recommended by the cartridge manufacturer, usually between 1 and 2.5 grams. Too much force and the stylus wore grooves into the vinyl, producing permanent distortion. Too little and the needle skipped across the record at the slightest vibration, scratching the surface. Some turntables had an anti-skate dial that compensated for the natural inward pull of the spinning record. Getting both adjustments right was the difference between a clean, warm playback and a scratched record that popped and clicked on every revolution. Streaming music requires no physical setup at all, and the turntable counterweight has become a niche concern for vinyl collectors. Number 19. reading a topographic map with a compass. Navigating backcountry terrain in the 1970s meant carrying a folded topographic map from the United States Geological Survey and a magnetic compass. The contour lines on the map represented elevation, and reading them correctly told you whether you were heading uphill, downhill, or along a ridge. Closely spaced lines meant steep terrain. Widely spaced lines meant a gentle slope. You oriented the map to north using the compass, identified your position by matching visible landmarks to the map's features, and plotted your route using the contour lines to judge difficulty. The real skill was triangulation, taking compass bearings on 2 or 3 known landmarks and drawing the lines on the map to pinpoint your location at their intersection. Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts learned this as a core outdoor competency. Smartphone GPS and apps like AllTrails now provide real-time position tracking on a screen, and the compass and contour skill has become a backup rather than a primary tool. Number 18. Making soap from rendered animal fat and lye. For most of American history, soap was not something you bought at a store. It was something you made at home, and the process was hands-on, time-consuming, and mildly dangerous. You started by saving kitchen grease and scraps of animal fat over a period of weeks, then rendering it by melting the fat slowly in a large pot and straining out the solids. The result was a clean tallow. Next came the lye, which was traditionally made by pouring water through hardwood ashes collected from the fireplace. The water leached potassium hydroxide from the ash, producing a caustic liquid strong enough to burn skin on contact. You combined the lye water and the melted fat in careful proportions, stirred the mixture steadily over low heat for an hour or more, and waited for it to reach a stage called trace, where the liquid thickened to the consistency of thin pudding. Then you poured it into wooden molds or shallow pans and left it to cure for several weeks until it hardened into bars. The chemistry of saponification turned the fat and the caustic alkali into something mild enough to wash with, but the process required respect. Lye burns were common, and getting the proportions wrong produced a bar that was either too harsh for skin or too soft to hold its shape. Farm wives and rural homemakers across the country made soap this way well into the 1950s, and some Appalachian and Ozark families continued the practice into the 1970s. Commercial soap bars from companies like Ivory and Dial had been available since the late 19th century, but homemade soap persisted in areas where store-bought products were expensive or hard to get. Today, soap making has resurfaced as an artisan hobby sold at craft fairs, but nobody makes it anymore because they have to. Number 17. Hanging wet laundry on a clothesline. Before electric dryers were standard in American homes, every load of laundry went outside. You carried a basket of wet clothes to the backyard line, hung each piece with wooden or spring-loaded clothespins, and spaced them to catch the breeze. Heavy items like jeans and towels went on the ends where the line was strongest. Shirts were hung upside down from the hem to prevent clothespin marks on the shoulders. Sheets went flat and took up the most space. The real skill was weather judgment. You checked the sky before hanging anything, because a surprise rain shower meant running out to pull everything down before it got soaked again. In winter, clothes froze solid on the line and had to be brought in stiff as boards to thaw indoors. Electric dryers became common in American homes during the 1960s and 1970s, and the daily clothesline ritual faded from most suburban neighborhoods. Number 16. Sharpening a lawnmower blade with a metal file. A sharp mower blade cut grass cleanly. A dull one tore it, leaving ragged brown tips across the lawn. Before bench grinders and blade sharpening services, the standard method was to remove the blade from under the mower deck, clamp it in a bench vise, and sharpen the cutting edge with a flat mill file. You filed in one direction only, following the original bevel angle, pushing the file along the edge in smooth strokes. The skill was maintaining a consistent angle and taking off just enough metal to restore the edge without thinning the blade. After sharpening both ends, you balanced the blade on a nail through the center hole. If one side dipped, you filed a little more off the heavy end. An unbalanced blade vibrated and damaged the mower's crankshaft. Electric sharpeners and cheap replacement blades have made hand filing a fading skill. Number 15. Replacing a typewriter ribbon. When the type on a page started printing faint and gray, the ribbon was spent and needed changing. You opened the top cover of the typewriter, lifted the old ribbon spools off their posts, and threaded the new ribbon through a set of small guide forks that held it in position between the type bars and the paper. The ribbon had to be routed correctly or it would jam, bunch, or print off-center. Most ribbons were universal black, wound on two small plastic spools. Some were two-tone, with a black half and a red half, controlled by a selector switch that let you type headings or corrections in color. The spools came sealed in a small cardboard box and cost about $2 at any office supply store. Installing one took 3 to 5 minutes if you knew the path. Personal computers and inkjet printers made the typewriter ribbon obsolete by the early 1990s. Number 14. Pumping water from a well with a hand pump. In rural America, well into the 1960s and beyond, many homes and farms drew their drinking water from a hand-operated pump mounted over a drilled or dug well. The pump had a long iron handle that you pushed down and pulled up in a steady rhythm, and each stroke drew a column of water up through a pipe from the water table below. Priming was essential. If the pump had been sitting idle, you had to pour a cup of water into the top of the mechanism to create the seal that allowed suction to work. Without that prime, the handle moved freely and nothing came out. Children learned the pumping rhythm early and often ran the pump as a daily chore, filling buckets for the kitchen, the livestock trough, and the garden. Municipal water systems and electric well pumps have replaced hand pumps in virtually every American home. Number 13. Curing meat in a backyard smokehouse. Preserving meat through the winter in rural America well into the 1960s meant building or maintaining a small smokehouse on the property. The process started with butchering, usually in late fall when temperatures dropped. You rubbed the cuts with a salt and sugar cure, packed them into crocks or hung them on hooks, and let the salt draw moisture out over several days. Then the meat went into the smokehouse, a small wooden or brick structure with a fire pit at the bottom, where it hung in the slow smoke of hickory, applewood, or oak for days or even weeks. Temperature control was critical. Too much heat cooked the meat instead of curing it. Too little allowed spoilage. The skill was tending the fire at a consistent low smolder. Home refrigerators and commercial meat processing made the backyard smokehouse unnecessary in most of the country by the 1960s. Number 12. Brewing coffee with a stovetop percolator. The standard American method for making coffee through the 1970s was the percolator, a tall metal pot with a basket and a vertical tube inside. You filled the pot with cold water, spooned ground coffee into the basket, set it on the stove over medium heat, and waited. As the water heated, it rose up through the tube, spilled over the grounds, dripped back down, and cycled through again and again. You watched the glass knob on the lid, which showed the color of the liquid as it darkened. The skill was knowing exactly when to pull it off the heat. Too soon, and the coffee was weak and watery. Too long, and it turned bitter and over-extracted. The percolator sound, that rhythmic bubbling pulse, was the background noise of every American morning for decades. Automatic drip coffee makers replaced percolators in most kitchens by the late 1970s. Number 11. Mowing a lawn with a manual push-reel mower. Before gasoline-powered rotary mowers became affordable, cutting the grass meant pushing a reel mower, a device with a set of spiral blades mounted on a horizontal cylinder that spun when the wheels turned. There was no engine. Your legs provided all the power. The cutting action was a scissors motion between the spinning reel blades and a fixed bottom bar, and it only worked if the blades were sharp and properly adjusted. Thick patches of grass or tall weeds stopped the reel cold, which meant you had to back up and push through again with more force. You learned to mow in straight, overlapping rows, and to keep a steady pace, because slowing down reduced the reel speed and left uncut strips. Sharpening the blades required a special tool or a trip to the hardware store. Power mowers dominated the suburban market by the 1960s, and the manual reel mower retreated to a small niche of environmentally conscious homeowners. Number 10. Reading a mercury thermometer. Every medicine cabinet in America once contained a glass thermometer filled with a thin column of liquid mercury. Taking a temperature meant shaking the thermometer with a sharp flick of the wrist to force the mercury back down below the 96-degree mark, placing the glass tip under the tongue, closing your mouth, and waiting 3 full minutes without talking or moving. Then you pulled it out and held it at eye level, rotating it slowly until the light caught the silver thread of mercury against the etched scale. Reading it required patience because the column was narrow and hard to see. A temperature above 98.6 meant a fever. Mercury thermometers were accurate and durable, but the mercury inside them was toxic, and broken thermometers spilled tiny silver beads that rolled across the bathroom floor and could not be safely vacuumed. Digital thermometers, which give a reading in seconds and contain no mercury, replaced them entirely. Number 9. Testing a 9-volt battery by touching it to your tongue. This was never an official technique taught in any manual, but it was universally known and universally practiced. When the smoke detector started chirping or a transistor radio went quiet and you were not sure whether the battery was dead, you pressed the 2 terminals of a 9-volt battery against the tip of your tongue. A fresh battery produced a sharp, tingling zap. A weak one gave a faint tingle. A dead one did nothing at all. The method worked because the tongue is moist and sensitive enough to detect even a small electrical current. It was crude, slightly unpleasant, and entirely reliable. Battery testers existed, but they cost money, and your tongue was free and always available. Digital multimeters and battery level indicators built into modern devices have made the tongue test unnecessary, though anyone who grew up with transistor radios remembers the taste of 9 volts. Number 8. Stripping wire insulation with a pocket knife. The way you prepared an electrical wire for a connection in the 1960s was to cut a ring around the insulation with a pocket knife and pull the casing off without nicking the copper underneath. The skill was in the pressure. Cut too deep and you nicked the copper conductor inside, weakening it. Cut too shallow and the insulation would not separate cleanly. You held the wire against your thumb and rotated the blade around the circumference in a controlled motion, scoring the plastic without biting into the metal. Electricians, farmers, and anyone who did their own wiring learned this technique as a basic practical skill. A good knife man could strip a wire as fast as any tool. Dedicated wire strippers, which are calibrated to cut through the insulation without touching the conductor, now cost a few dollars at any hardware store and have made the pocket knife method a relic. Number 7. Using a wall-mounted rotary pencil sharpener. Every classroom, office, and home study in America had one bolted to the wall or the edge of a desk. You inserted the pencil into the conical opening, turned the hand crank, and the internal blades shaved the wood into a perfect point. The skill was knowing when to stop. Crank too many times and you ground the pencil down to a nub. Stop too soon and the point was blunt. The satisfying curl of wood shavings fell into a small removable tray at the bottom that someone always forgot to empty until it overflowed onto the floor. Boston and X-Acto were the major brands. In schools, the pencil sharpener was mounted by the door, and sharpening a pencil was a socially acceptable reason to leave your seat. Electric sharpeners and mechanical pencils have made the hand crank wall mount increasingly rare, though a few still survive in older buildings. Number 6. Lighting a pilot light on a gas appliance. Gas stoves, water heaters, and furnaces all relied on a small, continuously burning pilot flame to ignite the main burner when the appliance was turned on. Pilot lights blew out regularly from a draft, a gust through an open window, or simply from age and soot buildup. Relighting one meant getting on your knees, locating the small pilot tube at the base of the appliance, turning the gas control knob to the pilot position, holding a lit match or lighter to the tip of the tube, and pressing the knob in for 30 seconds until the thermocouple heated enough to keep the gas valve open on its own. Release the knob too soon, and the pilot went out again. The smell of gas in the moments before the flame caught was unsettling but normal. Electronic ignition systems, which produce a spark automatically when the burner is called for, have replaced standing pilot lights in most modern appliances. Number 5. Beating eggs and cream with a hand crank egg beater. Before electric mixers were common, whipping cream, beating eggs, and blending batter meant using a hand-cranked rotary egg beater. You held the handle in one hand and turned the side crank with the other while the interlocking gears spun 2 wire beaters at high speed inside the bowl. Whipping cream to stiff peaks could take 5 minutes of steady cranking, and your arm felt it. The technique was in the angle and the speed. Too slow and the cream barely moved. Tilt the beaters wrong and the mixture splashed out of the bowl. Every kitchen in the country had one hanging on a hook or rattling around in a drawer. The sound of those spinning gears was as familiar as a ringing telephone. Electric stand mixers like the KitchenAid and handheld electric beaters replaced the manual version in most homes by the 1970s. Number 4. Making a long-distance call with a prepaid calling card. Through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, prepaid calling cards were how millions of Americans, especially college students, military families, and immigrants, made affordable long-distance phone calls. You bought a card at a gas station, a bodega, or a Walmart for $5 or $10, scratched off the silver strip on the back to reveal a PIN code, dialed a toll-free access number, entered the PIN, and then dialed the number you wanted to reach. A recorded voice told you how many minutes remained. The skill was managing your balance and knowing the per-minute rates, which varied by destination and time of day. Some cards advertised 100 minutes but buried connection fees and rounding charges in the fine print, leaving you with far fewer than promised. Unlimited cell phone plans and internet calling services made the calling card business collapse almost entirely. Number 3. Hand cranking a car engine to start it. On older automobiles, long before electric starter motors were standard, the only way to start the engine was to insert a heavy iron crank through a hole in the front of the car, position it on the crankshaft, and give it a hard, fast pull. The technique was dangerous. If the engine backfired, the crank could kick back with enough force to break a wrist or an arm. You learned to grip the handle with your thumb on the same side as your fingers, never wrapped around the opposite way, so a kickback would throw the crank out of your hand instead of spinning your arm with it. Electric starters had largely eliminated the hand crank by the 1930s, but farm trucks, tractors, and older vehicles in rural areas kept the skill alive for decades longer. Nobody born after the mid-20th century has ever needed to crank start a car. Number 2. Adjusting the color tint on a television set. Early color televisions from the 1960s and 1970s had a row of knobs on the front panel or behind a small door that controlled brightness, contrast, color saturation, and tint. The tint knob shifted the entire color balance between green and magenta, and getting it wrong turned every face on screen an unnatural shade of orange, pink, or green. The skill was in the subtlety. You adjusted the knob while watching a close-up of a person's face and stopped when the skin tone looked natural. Every family member had a slightly different opinion about what natural meant, which turned the tint knob into a source of minor household conflict. Networks sometimes broadcast a color test pattern before programming started, and careful viewers used it to calibrate their sets each morning. Modern televisions calibrate themselves automatically and have no front panel knobs at all. Number 1. Hitchhiking as a normal way to get around. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, sticking out your thumb on the side of a highway and catching a ride with a passing stranger was a routine, socially accepted method of transportation in the United States. College students hitchhiked home for the holidays. Young people traveled cross-country on nothing more than a backpack and the goodwill of drivers. Military servicemen in uniform could count on a ride within minutes at almost any on-ramp. The skill was real. You learned where to stand so drivers could see you and pull over safely, how to size up a vehicle before getting in, and how to make conversation that put the driver at ease. There were unwritten rules about which exit to ask for, when to offer gas money, and when to simply say thank you and walk. A wave of highly publicized roadside crimes during the late 1970s and 1980s transformed the public perception of hitchhiking from adventurous to dangerous almost overnight. State after state posted signs prohibiting it on interstate highways. Ride-share apps and cheap regional bus services have provided alternatives that did not exist before, and the sight of a lone figure with a thumb raised on the shoulder of a highway has all but vanished from American life. 100 skills. Every single one of them mattered once. Adjusting those rabbit ears was not a quirk, it was how a family watched the evening news together. Folding that road map was not a game. It was how you drove from Ohio to Florida without asking a stranger for directions. Churning butter by hand was not a hobby. It was Tuesday. The world moved on, the tools changed, and nobody asked whether anything was lost in the trade. If you grew up knowing how to do any of these, leave a comment and tell us which one you still catch yourself doing out of habit. Hit the like button if this one brought something back, subscribe for more, and we will see you in the next one.